So I'm one of those weird people who actually care about the gameplay in Persona games. If you've seen some of my videos already, you'll notice I spend a lot of time talking about gameplay mechanics. They're a large part of what shapes the experience, no matter how big or little. Never been too hot on people boiling Persona games down to just their story. It's what leads people into thinking they could just watch a Let's Play or read the manga for an equivalent experience. Which is why in this video, I'll be dissecting a seemingly inoffensive mechanic and its slow decline into the game breaker it is today. Now you might be thinking, really? Skill cards? It's probably not even a mechanic you'd think about unless it's brought up to you. Just how bad can it get? Well, strap in fellas, time for a little history lesson. So the origin of skill cards in Persona can actually be traced all the way back to the first entry. Skill cards didn't exist yet in the way we know them now, but this mechanic effectively functions as a precursor to that concept. In Persona 1, you're given the option to use an item in Persona Fusion. These items can have varying effects depending on what you use, but the only ones we care about for the purposes of this video are the spell rocks. In battle, these items cast a spell at no SP cost. But if you're using them that way, you're honestly shooting yourself in the foot. The best use for them is in fusion. They impart the skill that they cast onto the persona you're fusing. So effectively, it's a skill card. The mechanic is both kinda necessary and also kinda ruins the intrinsic value of each individual persona. You can buy heavy tier magic spell rocks for pretty cheap at one of the shops. They come in pretty much all magic elements too. Even healing. The vast majority of the time, whatever spell rock you give to a persona is going to be their best skill. Personas in Persona 1 really don't have great skills most of the time, except for the few exceptions. So on one hand, this alleviates that problem. On the other hand though, this means the only stat you're really going to care about for most personas is their magic attack. A persona is only worth the amount of damage they can deal, or if they can sufficiently heal your party. And that right there pretty much sums up the entire problem with skill cards. We've already rooted out the main problem and we've barely even gotten started. There's more! Persona 2 is the first game to introduce skill cards proper. They're given their own item slot in Fusion separate from other Fusion items. Most of the skill cards you get aren't really much to write home about. The only skill cards I ended up using were Medea Rahan and Makakaja. You kind of have the opposite of Persona 1's problem here. You're using personas more for their intrinsic value now, sure, but skill cards are largely just an afterthought. Plus getting them is kind of a chore too. You get mostly generic skills in chests over the course of the game, but a lot of the better ones are either locked behind max ranking high level personas, or through map completion. Yeah, no, not with this game's encounter rate. So, still mostly just a neat idea and nothing more. But after about a decade of waiting, we'd get what I consider to be their best implementation. Skill cards wouldn't be implemented in any games for a good while after Persona 2. The original releases of Persona 3 and 4 did not have them. But Persona 3 Portable and Persona 4 Golden made the decision to bring them back. And they came back with a vengeance. While some skill cards were obtainable through dungeon crawling and shuffle time, most of the best skills required you to fuse very specific personas and level them until they learn all of their level up skills. Sure, you could register a persona to the compendium right before it's about to produce one, but you needed to put in the work for that specific persona at least once. You could also duplicate skill cards at the Inari Shrine, but in Portable you had to leave the skill card there and wouldn't get it back until a few days later with the duplicates. It's not perfect by any means, but there was more cost in getting them. Be it in-game time, real time through doing quests, or a slot in your persona stock. It's an all-around good iteration of this mechanic. It should also be noted that Persona 3 Portable does not let you select skills to pass through in Fusion, so there's definitely a good incentive to use this mechanic. One of the directors of P3P, Azusa Kido, even stated that this mechanic was put in as sort of a compromise for people who wanted more control over what skills they wanted, while keeping the randomized selection in Fusion because the team viewed it as just a part of the game. Really goes to show you that Atlus did not make these games with the idea of an uber-optimized Fusion meta in mind. All of that was just a byproduct. Persona 4 Golden isn't too shabby either. Skill cards were indicated by an icon next to said skill. Some personas needed to level up a few times before learning their extractable skill. They must know the skill in order for it to be extracted. You can only get one skill card from a persona, so you'll have to rely on compendium entries again. And lastly, getting a skill card ate up your day activity. Now you can get some pretty decent skill cards from shuffle time. If you get lucky and get a magician card, a skill you taught via skill card can get upgraded. You can also register skill cards in the Velvet Room and buy them back, but they're pretty expensive even for Golden. I find myself getting the most use out of skill cards in this game without it getting to a point where I can farm or duplicate them effortlessly. On the final day of the game, whatever you have is what you're stuck with. You'll have to plan far in advance if you want specific skill cards for the Margaret boss fight. Again, not perfect, but very serviceable implementations of the skill card mechanic. Sadly, this is where it peaks. In Persona Q, characters have their main persona, their story-given one, and a sub-persona, a secondary persona they can equip that provides extra skills and stat boosts. Personas that have learned a skill with a card icon next to it can have that skill card extracted from them, like Persona 4 Golden. Only now, you're not just extracting your persona, you're straight up sacrificing it. It should be noted that skill cards can only be used on main personas, not sub-personas. You'll notice that every character's main has empty skill slots specifically for skill cards. This is pretty neat in concept because this means every persona, whether main or sub, has inherent value that can't just be overwritten. In Persona Q2, there are two types of skill cards, for your main and sub respectively. Blank cards are for sub-personas, and wild cards are for main personas. The cards aren't given to the persona you want to give a skill to, however. They're given to the persona that will be sacrificed onto another persona to impart said skill on them. These cards are obtainable as drops from rare shadows and FOEs. Depending on how many skill cards you want for specific persona builds, accumulating skill cards in either of these games can get quite grindy. I mean, sure, it's balanced, but you pretty much only have this one acquisition method, along with a few quests that give you specific ones. It's not as interesting as the previously established models of Portable and Golden. I don't know where else to fit this into the script, but I'll just mention that skill cards are relegated to just loot and request rewards in Persona 5 Strikers. There's no sacrificial fusion or skill card extraction. Instead, you have persona points, which are used to power up your current personas, but this is a drastically different mechanic from what we're talking about in this video, so let's just move on to Persona 5 proper. Persona 5's not the worst implementation of skill cards. There are some interesting qualities to them that encourage the player to take advantage of certain mechanics, but the cost of acquisition goes down greatly compared to the previously mentioned games. In Persona 5, you can get not only skill cards, but other items such as equipment through sacrificing a persona. The only real cost here is a persona that you can buy back pretty easily from the compendium. Money is really easy to come by in Persona 5. In Persona 5 Royal, the fusion alarm mechanic was introduced. Itemizing personas during an alarm will produce a better version of that persona's item. In the case of skill cards, yeah, you see where I'm going with this. Yusuke can also duplicate skill cards. Like Persona 3 Portable, he holds onto the card he's duplicating until the next available day in his schedule. Oops, I forgot at rank 7 he can do it instantly. Ain't that great? I mean, it's alright. At least there's a cost. It's not like they'd just give this shit out for free, would they? What? Why is there an awkward pause here? Wow, they actually did it. They really just went and made this shit free. You can duplicate one skill card per day at the Inari Shrine, but it's instantaneous and doesn't take up any time. In Episode Aegis, it costs Twilight Fragments, but those are basically like free candy. Sure, you still have to find skill cards before you can duplicate them, but your odds of not getting at least a few good skill cards over the course of your playthrough are basically zero. The other acquisition methods are the same as before: shuffle time, chests, and quests. In fact, you don't even need any particularly unique skills to break this game. Realistically, the only skill cards you're really going to need are the passive boost and amp skills, alongside apt pupil for physical builds. Said skills can then be continually passed on through fusion after fusion indefinitely. Quite literally, the game does everything in its power to make sure you can deck out your personas with ease. Did you know I once got a comment saying my criticisms of balancing are invalid because I optimize my personas? But I hope everyone watching this video can see they really do not make it hard to get some cracked out personas in this game. I also think this is just a really backwards mindset towards criticism. I'm pretty sure games like Kingdom Hearts 3 only got better post-patch because the dev team listened to the feedback of speedrunners and well-seasoned players who know the mechanics of these games very intimately. And in the end, this ended up having little to no impact on the people who already enjoyed the base game casually on lower difficulties. Who knows, maybe the response to Reload criticism will be reflected in the next Persona game. Wouldn't that be a wild concept? That being said, I think now would be a pretty good time to explore some of the better implementations of skill acquisition that follow a similar but more balanced model to skill cards. Let's start with a more recent example, Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance. This game doesn't have skill cards, but a similar mechanic in demon essences. You can get these in many different ways. You can get some from exploring the world and finding them, you can buy a specific selection of them, or you can get them by leveling up your demons. This usually entails leveling them beyond the point of learning all of their level up skills. This system comes with many caveats and conditions as well. You can only hold one of each demon's essence at a time. This incentivizes the player to use them sooner rather than hoarding them. While you can use them to impart skills onto your demons, they're actually the only way to acquire new skills for the protagonist. The skills that you can even inherit from your essences are also restricted based on your miracle progression. Unlocking the next listed skill on an essence will cost glory, which in itself requires a lot of exploring to accumulate over time. There's also another layer of decision making in making the player choose between taking on an essence's skills or resistances and weaknesses. This is an option that's exclusive to your protagonist. So yes, while there is potential to create some busted builds, there are also a lot of factors and moving parts to consider. How many demon essences even have this skill or a similar one? How easily can I get this essence back compared to others? How easily can I get back my current skills after I discard them, if I ever want them back? I think it's pretty neat. Now let's turn back the clock a little further, to before the modern Persona trilogy actually. That's right, it's time for me to talk about Digital Devil Saga. Again. My quest to get people to play this game is never ending. There is only one method of acquiring skills in this game, the mantra grid. Mantras are bought with Maka, or dollars in the second game. Mantras require a certain amount of Atma points to be mastered, which can be acquired through killing enemies normally, but you can gain much more if you devour your enemies instead. Devouring enemies can be done when an enemy is close to death, but it's actually a lot easier if you inflict fear on them by striking their weaknesses or blocking their attacks. This changes the way you approach battles, as it's no longer a simple matter of bursting down enemies until they die. They need to be alive for you to eat them whole. Once a mantra is mastered, that character learns those skills permanently. All skills are added to a skill pool, and you equip them to your limited number of skill slots. Every mantra only needs to be bought once per character, so if you buy a mantra but then decide you want this character to work on a different one instead, you could just switch them over and switch back whenever you want. Regardless of whether you're working with the more straightforward grid of DDS1 or the more flexible grid of DDS2, Pretty much all of the best skills will require you to master a bunch of other mantras to get to them. Hell, in the case of DDS2, you have much more freedom to choose the optimal path to reach the other mantras. What skills can you get on the way that'll work the best for your character's build? Some of them are locked behind beating certain optional bosses too. In the case of Digital Devil Saga, the cost of learning skills is money, a more methodical approach to encounters, and routing out your skill paths. Most players will probably prioritize one path of skills and have a secondary or tertiary skill path to work on if they can't afford the highest level mantra for their current skill path. The progression in skills feels very natural because you're forced to get certain skills in order. You'll never get anything too overpowered unless you take the time to do a lot of unnecessary grinding. Man, DDS is just an all-around good game even outside of this mechanic. Please, do yourself a favor and play this game. Let's wrap this up with a non-Megaten example. Probably the simplest and most sensible comparison I could have made. It was so obvious, and yet I'm only just remembering to mention it now. TMs, or technical machines, in the Pokemon games. They are effectively just like skill cards. They're an item that you can give to a Pokemon to teach them a move. Now, in some games they have infinite uses, in other games they're consumable. How expendable they are can also vary from game to game, but the thing they have in common across all the games is that you cannot give them to just any Pokemon. There are restrictions on what moves a Pokemon can or cannot learn. This can help make Pokemon move pools feel more personalized, and help Pokemon of the same type find their own little nuances and niches to distinguish themselves. This can work, or fail, to varying degrees, but it can lead to some really interesting variety, seeing the many ways one can handle just one Pokemon out of their full team of 6. In older Pokemon games where most TMs are one of a kind, you not only have to consider who's even able to learn it, but also who needs it more, or who can make the best use of it. Do I really need to give Blizzard to my Ice Pokemon who gets a same type attack bonus with its Ice Beam, or should I give it to another Pokemon for coverage? Just like Megaten, move slots are a factor to consider as well, only now you're limited to 4. Are there better setups I could be occupying my limited slots on? In the case of Pokemon, it's less about the costliness of teaching moves to your Pokemon. It's more about what your limitations are and working around them. So, why did I even bother bringing up all these other examples? What's the point? The goal of this video was to shed light on what skill cards in Persona are missing. Each of the examples I just gave had something in place to keep their respective systems from going too out of whack. Trade-off, sense of progression, and restriction. Now, you don't absolutely need to have all 3 of these things at once, but Persona could certainly benefit from having one of any of these things. Skill cards in Persona, at least as they are now, are too easily obtainable. While skills technically have tiers to them, you don't really get any sense of consistent progression in the types of skills you get. It's still pretty sporadic what kind of skills you get and the quality of said skills. And across pretty much all of the games, they ignore any skill inheritance rules. Skill cards are not a bad idea in principle. They allow for a lot of flexibility for the player to experiment and get creative with how they create personas. And they might even make doing certain fusion requests easier. But powerful tools need good checks and balances, not just to prevent trivializing the challenge, but to prevent trivializing other existing mechanics too. Why bother putting any thought into fusion when you can just take any random persona and give it all the skill cards it needs to be perfectly self-sufficient? I'm not saying skill cards should be removed entirely, they just need a rework. I don't really like when games discard ideas that have great potential just because they have flaws. I like when games get creative and explorative with their design. Sometimes, you just gotta play around with an idea enough to come out with something truly great. There's a lot to talk about with game mechanics. Even something seemingly small on a surface level can have a lot of layers to it. Most of you probably weren't expecting a video all about this single mechanic that most players would consider a footnote in the grand scheme of things. But I did it. I guess that just goes to show you that game mechanics really do matter, even the ones you don't pay attention to. Hell, why stop here? There's not enough mechanical analysis on these games online in my opinion, so I think I want to start doing these types of videos more often. I might even be working on another video right now, as you're hearing this sentence.